Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the first of several lectures to cover foraging strategies and nutrition in marine mammals. For this lecture, we'll get an introduction by looking at the digestive tract. We'll first explore just the basic anatomy and function of the mammalian digestive system, and then turn and explore a little bit more on what marine mammals do differently than a terrestrial mammal such as humans. Before beginning, we actually need to focus on some of the terminology that is often associated with digestion. So when we think about the digestive tract, there's actually several terms that mean different things that are all kind of associated with the process of digestion. First and foremost, if you're going to eat food, the process of basically putting food in your mouth is called ingestion. And then breaking that food up into small particles is called digestion. So even though a lot of people will think ingestion and digestion are the same thing, they're actually separate. So putting something in your mouth is ingestion, breaking it down into small particles is digestion. And then once you have it down into small food particles, you want to absorb it. And so you have absorption, which is actually the most critical part, because without absorption, you're essentially going to starve your body of that food that you've put into your digestive system. And then anything that's not absorbed is eliminated as feces. So when we look at the digestive tract in animals, most animals, including many invertebrates, the digestive tract is really just one long tube. So when you're looking at it, even for a simple earthworm, the digestive system begins with the mouth and ends with the anus, and it's just one long connected tube. Now, the more complex the organism, the more compartments the digestive tube is broken up into, and the more specialization each compartment has. So an earthworm has a relatively simple, complete digestive system, whereas it's really just one long tube and there's not a lot of difference between the beginning, the middle, and the end, whereas in a human, there's quite a bit of difference for what happens closer to the mouth versus what's happening in the intestine. So let's actually look at the anatomy of the digestive system for a human. So we're going to do kind of a brief overview. This isn't all the parts, but it's certainly the major structures that go along with our tube. So we know we start with the mouth and we end with an anus, but what are the compartments that are found in between? Well, once food enters the mouth, the next place that it goes into is the esophagus. And so the esophagus is going to be right here on the computer screen, this long tube that basically connects the mouth all the way down to the next big compartment, which is the stomach. And then once we get into the stomach, we leave the stomach and move into the intestine. We have a small intestine here, so named because it has a smaller diameter, before moving into the large intestine, which has a larger diameter, and then finally the anus. Now this is a simplistic diagram, but if we move actually over to the human here, we can follow the same structures. It's still one long tube. Mouth, esophagus, stomach, curls around into a whole long mess of tubes known as the small intestine before getting into the larger tube, which is the large intestine, and then passing out the anus. And of course, you might have noticed on the simplistic diagram that there's these green structures over here. Those green structures are accessory glands like the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder that all contribute to digestion in some way. So what are each of the functions in a human? Well, we pretty much know what the mouth is for. The mouth is for ingestion. So you put food in your mouth, but usually you don't swallow your food whole, at least not purposefully. And so you've got accessory organs in there like teeth and tongue, and that of course is used to help grind up the food into smaller parts. I often say in class that if we have a Dorito and we put the Dorito in our mouth, we obviously do some things to the Dorito before we swallow that Dorito chip. And of course, this includes breaking it up into many small food particles. So in humans, the mouth is also responsible for some of digestion. Clearly, you do not swallow a Dorito chip whole. You chew it up, you mix it with saliva before swallowing it. And if you you've ever not chewed your food thoroughly, you know that it's an uncomfortable trip down the esophagus. So what happens in the stomach? Well, the stomach is going to be a site of further digestion. In fact, the stomach is highly acidic, which is one of the reasons why it tends to be closed off from the other parts of the digestive tract. And we further break down food into small parts. From there, we move into the small intestine, where we finish breaking everything down into its smallest compartment, and then we do the bulk of our absorption in the small intestine as well. The large intestine is actually a place where we absorb the rest of the water that might be in that, what you might consider to be a food soup at this point, and as well as compact the leftovers into feces before defecation. So that kind of gives you an overview of how humans utilize the digestive system. So now I want to turn to the human mouth, because as I mentioned before, the mouth ends up being an important place of ingestion and digestion together. So what are some of the features of the mouth? Of course, the most obvious is going to be our teeth, and in marine mammals, many marine mammals have teeth, but some also have baleen. So that's something different that we'll talk about here in a moment. But then there's also a tongue and the salivary glands. So what are each used for? Well, the teeth are used for grinding. This is something known as mechanical digestion. In other words, it doesn't use chemicals to help with digestion. It's simply the mechanics of breaking food down into smaller parts. Similar to if I were to give you some bread, dried out bread, and you were to put it in a Ziploc bag and you were to try to make breadcrumbs, you could do that mechanically by grinding up the breadcrumbs with your fingers in that Ziploc bag. So the teeth do the same thing, and the tongue helps. The tongue helps by positioning food. The salivary glands, in which you have many, contribute saliva. Now, saliva is going to help coat that chewed up food before being swallowed. If it doesn't coat that food and you do swallow, that food tends to get stuck in the esophagus, which is extremely uncomfortable. So the salivary glands predominantly help that food bowl, it's called a bolus actually, when you've got a little chewed up ball of food, go down the esophagus smoothly and make it into our stomach. So what about marine mammals? Well, let's take a look at some of the mouth structures, starting with the teeth. In marine mammals, the shape and variety of the teeth, or in some cases absence of teeth, but analogous structures like baleen, 100% reflect their dietary preferences. So let's go through the major marine mammals and take a look again at some of their teeth or teeth-like features. Of course, you've already learned that mysticetes are defined by their baleen. In fact, the mysticetes don't really even have any teeth. They just have rows of these coarse hair-like structures known as baleen. In this picture here, which is a wide open shot of a minke whale, the smallest baleen whale, you might also notice that they have a very large tongue. So here they have rows of baleen on the top and a very large tongue on the bottom. Now, what about the marine mammals that have teeth? Not all marine mammals have the same type and shape of teeth, as we're going to learn in a later lecture. In fact, even small differences in teeth shape are very reflective of differences in diet. So I want to come over here and take a good look at some of the teeth that you might expect to see on some of the marine mammals. Now, this is the lower jaw of an odontoceti. So this is actually a bottlenose dolphin, and you might notice that the teeth all have a conical shape, and they are all conical, which makes them homodonts. A homodont is going to be an animal that has all one shape of tooth. Pinnipeds, on the other hand, are more like humans as heterodonts. A heterodont is going to have different shaped teeth, which are used for different activities, maybe like capturing versus grinding the food. It's important to note that most marine mammals that do have teeth do not chew their food the same way humans do. Their teeth are used more for capture, possibly tearing large chunks and then swallowing their food in large chunks. So they don't chew and grind usually in the same way that humans do. So what about some other mouth morphologies? Well, some marine mammals lack teeth or baleen altogether, such as this beluga, and their very large tongue makes up for that by allowing them to create a vacuum in their mouth that is used to suck prey in, and this is called suction feeding. We see suction feeding with belugas, we see suction feeding with walruses and some of the other marine mammals that we'll explore a little bit later. And another interesting mouth morphology is the fact that because a lot of these marine mammals do not chew their food and swallow their food whole, there's no reason to coat their food in saliva, and so then they have smaller than would be expected salivary glands. So with that, let's take a look at the last two compartments, the stomach and the intestine. And for the stomach, one of the more interesting ideas is the fact that because the food is reaching the stomach more or less in very large chunks and not chewed up, the stomach has to make up for that by doing a lot more of the work that teeth would normally do in humans, which means that they have actually taken their stomach, enlarged it, and compartmentalized it in many cases. In many of the marine mammals, such as baleen whales and even some of the pinnipeds, the very first compartment of the stomach, which is called the forestomach, is often found to contain pebbles and stones that they purposely swallow and keep in that forestomach. Now, what do you think that's for? If you were to take a bag and put stones and pebbles in it and then throw in like a fish or a crustacean like a lobster, for example, and start squeezing that bag together with the stones and pebbles, the stones and pebbles would actually help mechanically grind up harder structures like fish bones and the exoskeleton of some of those crustaceans. So they almost take what we think of as the function of our teeth and move it down into their forestomach, which is really an interesting adaptation to help them break up food particles before it moves on to the intestine. And then finally, let's take a look at the intestine. Now, the intestine doesn't usually differ that much by marine mammal in terms of structure, but it does differ in length. In fact, as a rule, intestinal length is usually reflective of the difficulty of digestion. Plant material, as a rule, is more difficult to digest than animal material. So if you're an herbivore and you tend to eat a lot of plant-like material, you tend to have a very long digestive system. So cows, koala bears, other animals that tend to be herbivores tend to have really long intestines. Humans have an intestinal length that averages about 30 feet for the average human, which ranges between 5 to 6 times the length of our body. That tends to be more typical of a carnivore. And so when we look at the mysticetes, which are the baleen whales, they show that similar trend. Their intestines are also about 5 to 6 times the length of their bodies, whereas the odontocetes show a much longer intestine than would be expected. They're about 15 times the length of their bodies. Why is not really known, but one possible reason is the idea that odontocetes dive deeper, and while they're diving, unfortunately, they shunt blood away from their intestine, and so they're not absorbing as much as they would normally if they were closer to the surface. So it actually maybe helps keep the food in there longer so that they have time to regain digestive and absorption function when they come to the surface during a period of rest where they're not diving deep. That's one possible hypothesis for explaining their abnormally long intestinal length. And with that, I will see you next time.